Welcome to the TAE program Introduction webinar series. This webinar is the Introduction to Assessment. The webinar learning outcomes are: the student U will explain assessment and competency-based assessment, the principles of assessment and rules of evidence, and purpose of assessment. My name is Murray Humphrey and I'm a trainer assessor with Inspire Education, and I'm going to take you through this short webinar to help you gain the knowledge of assessment that will help you through the rest of your course in the Certificate 4 in Training Assessment, as well as giving you foundation knowledge that will assist you in any role that you have with a training organisation or working within the vocational education training sector. First thing we need to look and understand is what is assessment. And a broad definition is: assessment is the process of forming and recording a judgment about a person's skills and knowledge. It's very important. There are two parts to this. It's you making a judgment as an assessor on a candidate's skills or knowledge in the workplace. And secondly, it's recording, having the evidence to support that judgment with a training record in determining a person's competence. The second thing we need to think about is: what is competency-based assessment? Assessment is a very broad area that incorporates assessment within a school sector, assessment within the tertiary sector or university studies, as well as assessment within the workplace or vocational education and training system. And in relation to this, let's look at competency-based assessment. And the definition is: the focus of assessment is on whether or not the person being assessed performs a task to the standard expected in the workplace, and focuses on what a person can do rather than on how they learnt to do it. And in relation to competency assessment, there are two types of assessment systems. The first one is a criteria reference system, and the second is a norms reference system. Let's understand what a criteria reference system is all about. It's where the candidate performance is compared to an assessment criteria. Is not a competitive process. All candidates have the opportunity to succeed, and the requirements for success remains constant. So when we talk about a criteria reference system, we're talking about a system where it's a person is assessed on their knowledge and skills, and they become competent in their own time. So it's all about them being having a judgment of competence on the knowledge and skills in the workplace, rather than a norms reference system is where the candidate's performance is compared with the other candidate's performance. It is a competitive process. Not all candidates will succeed, and the requirements for success fluctuates depending on the performance levels of the candidates. And when we talk about a norms reference system, we're talking about the system used within a tertiary education system, where you'll hear people talk about the standard bell curve, where a group of people, let's say 100 people, results are compared to each other, and there will be a certain amount of failures, as well as there will be a certain amount of passes, and also a certain amount of people that achieve honours or distinctions. Whereas within the criterion reference system, we only talk about two things. They're either competent or not yet competent, and they are competent in their own time in achieving that success without being compared to any other candidates in that workplace. And it's very important to understand that the VET system is a criteria referenced assessment systems. And when we talk about they're compared to the assessment criteria or the benchmarks in which they're going to be assessed against, those benchmarks are the units of competency contained within the training packages. And as we move on into this webinar of assessment, we need to understand within the VET system there are 4 principles of assessment. And those 4 principles of assessment are, first of all, I'll make sure I don't interfere with the presentation. First of all, we have that the first principle of assessment is that it's valid. When the process assesses what it claims to assess, that it's actually assessing the right benchmarks or the right performance criteria relevant to a role and task within the workplace. The second principle of assessment is that is reliable. It is that it's about the consistency of the interpretation of the evidence and the consistency of the assessment outcomes. And what we're looking at there is making sure that somebody that is assessed, for example, in the mining industry in Queensland, is using the same assessment system or same assessment instrument being used in Western Australia, and that same assessment tool or instrument being used by a different assessor gives a consistent result time and time again, and therefore qualifying it is reliable in relation to the assessment process that a candidate, whether it be in Queensland or Western Australia, is achieving. The second one is that the fairness, when the assessment process is clearly understood by the candidates, it's agreed by both the assessor and candidates, and when the candidates' needs and characteristics are addressed. So in relation to the assessment process you take a candidate through, it is very important that to be fair to that candidate, they understand the purpose of the assessment, that the instructions to an assessment are clearly set out for the candidate to understand, that they're aware that they have the ability to appeal, and the confidentiality of those records are maintained so that the assessment process the candidate is going through is deemed as fair. The final principle of assessment is flexibility, in that there is a consideration of the various needs of the parties involved in the assessment process. It's very important to make sure that a candidate has the flexibility to undertake an assessment in their own times and in line with their needs. An example of that may be a shift worker who is working outside of hours, and the assessment process is flexible enough to adapt to their needs and the time of when they can carry out a particular assessment. So these are the 4 principles of assessment: valid, reliability, fairness, and flexibility. The next thing we need to consider are the 4 rules of evidence. Now, when we're talking about the rules of evidence, we're talking about the hard copy record that will support, or the training record, the evidence records that will support our decision of competence. It's the actual proof that an RTO holds to support their decision. And the first rule of evidence is that it is valid, that the assessment record is valid and relates to the competency. Again, I'll remove myself from there. It relates to the competency standard being assessed. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about that the assessment instruments being used to collect the evidence and hold the evidence are being assessed against the performance criteria of the unit of competency, that it addresses the required knowledge and skills contained within the unit of competency, and also addresses the critical aspects of evidence that are found within that unit of competency. And again, very important to understand a lot of the information in relation to the principles and also the rules of evidence are contained in the evidence guidelines within the unit of competency. Moving down, the second rule of evidence is sufficient. Is there enough evidence to support a judgment of competency? We need to make sure that we're collecting evidence that is based over a period of time, over a number of contexts or a number of situations, rather than making a decision or a judgment on a person's competence where we've collected just a questionnaire and done one observation. Is that enough evidence based on the evidence guidelines set out within the unit of competency to make a judgment? We really would need to probably collect a number of pieces or a few pieces of evidence over a period of time to make the best judgment on that person's competent or not being competent and the areas for improvement moving forward. The third rule of evidence is that the evidence is current. It proves that the candidate is competent today, that it's in line with a current unit of competency, and that it is relevant to the industry and the workplace in which they're working in. And when we talk about current, it's very important to understand that industry is continually moving. You can have an example where somebody may say they would like a certificate in IT networking. And in relation to that, say, okay, what would be current? If they were to say, yes, I was working in marketing for 15 years and I was working within the IT network 15 years ago and I worked with the Commodore 65, is that current? Again, you need to understand the IT industry is moving every 2 years, so that we would need to make sure that any evidence that we collect is current in relation to probably 2 years in relation to that industry. Again, we need to make sure that the evidence that we collect from our candidate is current. The final rule of evidence is authentic, and that is the evidence will be verified as being the candidate's own. Again, in relation to this authentic rule of evidence, when we collect evidence, we ask our candidates to sign authenticity or get a statement of authenticity that the work is their own work. Other rules that apply to this being authentic is when we need to validate a qualification. If somebody is undertaking a recognition process, or you'll learn later on when we talk about recognition of prior learning, that if they produce a previous qualification, that we are able to verify the authenticity by contacting the issuer of that qualification that it is true and correct. And these are the 4 rules of evidence. As we move through the webinar, you need to understand what a reasonable adjustment is that apply to the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment. And a reasonable adjustment is a change made to any aspect of assessment process to accommodate the unique needs of a particular candidate. Should say their candidate rather than candidated. In relation to that, we are talking about there may be a requirement in relation to a candidate's language literacy and numeracy ability, where they may be illiterate, and you may need to make a reasonable adjustment around an assessment to cater for their special needs. And for example, they may have to be required to do a written assessment, and they declare to you that they are that they're illiterate, so effectively affected by their language literacy and numeracy, to conduct the assessment. Therefore, you would scribe or appoint a scribe for them to dictate, and that person or the scribe to write down the answers for them. Another reasonable adjustment may be somebody has some sort of health condition, in that they might have broken their hand, and again that would require you to appoint a scribe to write down the answer that they verbalized to that scribe. Again, it's making a reasonable adjustment around the assessment to accommodate for their candidate's specific needs. There are any other adjustments may be around a person with a disability. It may be somebody with English as their second language, or it may have some cultural or religious requirements that need to be reasonable adjustment. As long as the reasonable adjustment does not affect the validity of the other rules or principles of assessment, it is allowable. As we move through, we also come to when we're assessing competence of a person in the workplace, we talk about the 4 dimensions of competence. And again, this is an earlier slide from what we talked about in the introduction to VET, and where we're assessing somebody's knowledge, skills and attitude. We talked about attitude as being their confidence to do the knowledge and skills for a particular task in the workplace. There are 4 things that we need to talk about in relation to assessment, and they are the 4 dimensions of competence. And as you can see there, they are the task skills, the task management skills, the job, role and environmental skills, and the contingency management skills. And as we discussed, when we assess the knowledge, skills and attitudes of persons, we're actually assessing the task skills that they can actually undertake, the task skills. And it's more than that, being able to manage the task management skills in undertaking not only that job, but also the other jobs and tasks associated with that role in the workplace. Also, the third, we need to be aware that there are job environmental skills, that there are certain expectations of the performance in that role with other people working around them, and to meet the expectations and requirements of the people that they work for. And finally, the contingency management skills in relation to dimensions of competency, where if what happens, something goes wrong in completion of those task skills, are they able to effectively manage that? And if something goes wrong, can they plan and effectively reach an outcome using some other strategy or task skill to achieve the outcome for that performance criteria? So again, when we talk about competence, competency-based assessment, we also need to be aware of the 4 dimensions of competency, which are the task skills, the task management skills, the job environmental skills, and the contingency management skills. Moving to the next slide, we talk about the purpose of assessment. And what I'd like to start with is this area. We need to, what we talk about, determine the language, literacy and numeracy requirements. And when we talk about assessment, we talk about diagnostic assessment. It's about the assessment prior to assessing somebody's competence within the within a knowledge or skills. Do they have the ability to undertake those knowledge and skills? And that's what we call, it's like conducting a training needs analysis prior to completing the training and assessment of a person in a particular unit of competency. We then move to the next one. We need to establish the progress towards their achievement of competence, and we call this the formative assessment. And in that, it's very important to have a clear outline for an assessment, that we have an assessment plan and a process to take that candidate through. We also need to make sure that we have clear instructions and instruments that help us form a decision of competence. And when we talk about formative assessment, we're talking about completing assessment throughout an assessment process that help us establish a trend of competence. It forms part of the final judgment in relation to an assessment. And that's where we move down to this. The purpose of assessment is to determine that the competence has been achieved following the learning. And this is what we call the summative assessment. It is the final assessment where we are making our judgment on a candidate's knowledge and skills in being able to do a role within the workplace. Are they competent or not yet competent? It is our final judgment. And in relation to those, you need to understand there are different types, different assessments, and they can be diagnostic, or the pre-assessment, the formative assessment that helps us form a decision of competence, and the final is the summative assessment, where we are making our final judgment on a candidate's competence of or not yet competent within the particular knowledge or skills for a workplace or unit of competency. Also, the purpose of assessment is to recognize the current existing competence of a person. And as you can see there are 2 pathways that can be undertaken in relation to assessment. It can be a learning and assessment pathway, in which we take them through a training component and then do the assessment, or it can be an assessment only pathway, or what we call recognition pathway, where we acknowledge the experience, the existing knowledge and skills of those people, and we just take them through an assessment only process. And it's in common language is called recognition of prior learning, or previously referred to as recognition of current competency. And finally, it's a very important component of the purpose of assessment is to satisfy licensing and regulatory requirements, where we as an RTO, a registered training organisation, is undertaking a continuous improvement process and using validation and moderation of their assessment practices to make sure of their existing registration and ongoing quality management processes is all an important process, or very important in relation to the purpose of assessment for a registered training organisation. And as we move through into the next section of the webinar, we need to understand, again, this is our final slide in relation to the content, understanding competency-based assessment, is it needs to be client focused. We need to make sure that the assessment we're undertaking is focusing on the people in the workplace or in a simulated environment. It focuses on the it's participatory of the candidate, so that they're actively involved in relation to an assessment. That it focuses on it gives them the ability to be able to make reasonable adjustments for a particular candidate's needs. Also, that they have the right to appeal, that they have the right to confidentiality in relation to any process that we're taking it through. And also, we have the ability to tailor the assessment to a specific workplace that may work within a particular industry sector within the Australian workplace. So again, there are a number of components that it's client focused, that we can contextualize a unit of competency to fit a particular workplace. Finally, it's based on criteria, and as I said to you, it's based on in relation to the vet sector, that's based on the performance criteria of a unit of competency for a particular industry training package. And finally, that it is evidence-based, that we are making our decision or judgment of competence for a candidate based on the rules of evidence, that the evidence that we're collecting, the hard copy proof of our training record, is that it's valid, is that it's authentic, it is current, and we have enough evidence to make a judgment on competence. Well, that concludes this very short webinar on an introduction to assessment. You need to understand what assessment is, understanding that the vet sector is a criterion or a criteria reference-based system where a person is judged competent or not yet competent in their time, and it's a non-competitive system. You need to understand the principles of assessment as well as the 4 rules of evidence, and understanding how that affects the assessment decisions and judgments that you will make. And finally, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and I wish you well in relation to your continuing studies through your Certificate 4 in Training Assessment, and I hope you found this webinar helpful. Thank you and goodbye.